Billy Biter and the Parkin. It's in the first place collected by Ruth Tongue. We won't go into a debate about whether she collected it or wrote it. It's a nice story, but I've moved it round a little bit to where it really belongs. So, Billy Biter and the Parkin. There were two cottages which faced each other across a gully. There were no immediate neighbours because of the dragon that slept in the gully that even now was dozing, sated with its last feast of cows and sheep, and a couple of people who claimed that the whole dragon thing was a hoax and hadn't moved away in time. But the two houses were one Mrs. Greenaway's. Now everyone knew that old Mrs. Greenaway had mastery over herbs and warts and charms and things like that. So presumably she had mastery over the dragon as well. It didn't bother her. The other house everyone still called old Mrs. Biter's, from when she and her son Billy used to share it. Billy, the travelling tailor round there. They were a lovely, kind couple of people. And there'd always be Tom Puss washing himself by the fire. Billy, people used to say, merry as an elf. But when his mother died, well, it wasn't long before that Hepzibah turned up and browbeat poor Billy into marrying her. Not because she cared a jot for him, but because that was the nearest house to the inn down the hill. Every day she would take Billy's pay money from him. Every day she would head down to the inn, clutching her real love, the leather blackjack bottle for gin. Most evenings, Billy would come home and find the cottage cold and dark. He would light the fire, warm up Tom Puss, and then he would head down the hill with a wheelbarrow to fetch his wife back. Now, she was as skinny as a rake and more, but there were 6 foot of her, so it was a hard job for a little man like Billy to cope. When she was home and she was awake, like as not, she'd chase him and Tom Puss out of the door with the end of the broom handle. And they'd go up on the roof where she was too lazy to reach. And many, many nights, old Mrs. Greenaway would see them up there on the rooftop, cuddling onto the chimney for a bit of warmth. And people around there began to notice that Billy was looking pale and wan from a lack of food and a lack of sleep. They'd say, that Billy Biter. I'm saying nought, but that Hepzibah. Well, one day, old Mrs. Greenaway called Billy in as he went past her front door. Now then, Billy, she didn't do small talk. You look fair clemmed. Where's the pay money? Hand it over. Now, Billy had worked hard for that pay money, but he was always rather intimidated by Mrs. Greenaway, so he blinked and meekly handed it over. Right, she said. That goes in my dresser drawer. Here's this silver 6pence back. Hepzibah will need that to go down her throat. Billy wasn't sure there'd been a silver 6pence in there, but there was now, so he took it. Get this down you, she said. Gave him some bread and cheese. On your way. Well, that night she saw Billy and poor old Tom Puss up on the roof again, while the dragon, who was getting hungry, was beginning to groan in his sleep. And the next night it was the same, except the dragon was groaning a bit louder. The third day, the farm where Billy was working, the wife looked at him and said, "Hey, Billy Biter, merry as an elf you were. Here, get this down you." And she gave him a proper farmhouse tea. And then, "And I've made this up, just a bit of provisions. You'll take it." No argument. And she and her husband bundled it up and tied it on his back, along with a faggot of firewood that the farmer added. Made him look a bit like a giant snail that had grown spindly little legs. "It's heavy," said the farmer, "but I dare say it's not as heavy as a full wheelbarrow load." He got a sharp look from his wife for that. Well, spindly legs or not, they served him well enough, and Billy went off, but his legs were led astray by his nose, which smelled Parkin. Now, if you've smelt Parkin baking, no further explanation needed. But if you haven't, it's a Yorkshire speciality. It's always baked in squares. And I was checking with our son-in-law, who comes from Sheffield and knows about these things. And it's got a lot of treacle, a lot of ginger, a lot of cinnamon. It's very sticky. It's very tasty. It smells gorgeous. And his nose led him straight to old Mrs. Greenaway's door. Now then, Billy, come in. Give us that pack. So Billy meekly handed it over. She didn't open it. She just looked and shook something over it like a flour sifter. And then, you might notice I've been baking. Parkin. Billy's nose had hardly noticed anything for the last half mile. Here's a bit for you, and she gave him a large square. Here's a bit for Tom Puss. Put that in your pocket, a smaller square. And here's a bit, and she broke off from the other corner very carefully. Here's a bit for Hepzibah. That's for Hepzibah. Not for the likes of you nor Tom Puss. Now, be on your way, Billy. Billy's feet knew the way home perfectly well. He'd walked it hundreds, thousands of times. But somehow, maybe he was dreaming of Hepzibah actually cooking those provisions he'd been given. His feet found themselves on the very edge of the Dragon's Gully, where it was too steep to turn round, and he found himself falling onto something hot and hard. He landed on his back, and his pack saved him from being hurt. But something like a very large, round, red oil lamp opened up right next to him and said, "Yurr!" Now, I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that the dragon has flown up specially all the way from the southwest of England to appear in this story. So you're impressed. Yurr, he said, "That's my eye you're poking that stick into. Now, stand up. Let's see what's for dinner." Well, Billy's knees were trembling so much that Tom Puss, up on the roof half a mile above, could hear him. He was trembling so much he dropped the Parkin, and the dragon's tongue snaked out and shot it. He couldn't say anything for a bit because Parkin is extremely sticky, but when he could, "Oh, that's nice. What do you call that?" "But Parkin," said Billy. "Right. Well, you go get me some more of that because it's a lot more tasty than you're going to be, little squirt. Go on." And the dragon sneezed, and Billy found himself flying up through the air with rather hot trousers. He arrived on the roof of the house, right on top of Tom Puss. And the scorched rope of his pack broke, and the pack fell down the chimney, rolled across the floor, and woke up Hepzibah, who was lying sprawl-eagled across what had been Mrs. Biter's favourite chair by the fire. Of course, she spotted the Parkin, carefully wrapped up in its leaves, crammed it into her mouth, and after a period in which she couldn't speak very much, she yelled up the chimney, "Billy Biter! What do you mean by chucking cake down chimney at your poor defenceless wife? What do you call that sort of cake anyway?" "Parkin," said Billy. "Parkin? Is that what that witch sent you with home as Parkin? Thou come down here, Billy Biter. It'll be worse for thee if they have to come and get thee. Give me a hand." And poor Billy didn't dare disobey. He found himself watching for the first time since they'd been married as his wife cooked, baked, mixed all the ingredients from that pack into a monster dough. It had to go in the pig trough, and she climbed in with her bare, warty, horny, corny feet to knead it. And then she found a great big, round, cartwheel-sized baking tray. "Round," muttered Billy to Tom Puss, who'd come to watch. "Round. Parkin's is square." "I heard that," yelled Hepzibah. "When I've taken this to show that witch what Parkin is like, I'll show thee the end of broomstick." Now, of course, all the noise was getting the neighbours out further away than usual though they were, and they come out to see. And after a while, they saw Hepzibah staggering out of the house doorway, shucking her feet into her boots, clutching something the size of a huge cushion in front of her. Smelt very strongly of Parkin. Saw her trip over her undone laces, saw her feet begin to run and stumble despite themselves down the hill, heard a scream that any Archer's scriptwriter would have been proud of as she fell into the chasm heard that of the dragon's teeth and jaws, heard, "Oh, that's worse than flying through a swarm, and that's with your mouth open. Ugh. Oh, caw," as the Parkin that had been teetering on the edge of the gully fell down after her. Oh. And then nothing else, because the dragon's teeth were well and truly glued together by that Parkin. When they realized this, they rushed to get billhooks and pitchforks, but before they could decide who was going to start working on the dragon flapped his way into the air, flew out to sea, circled round and came back in, landing in the waves facing up the beach with his head ducked into the waves to wash that Parkin out. There was a great gout of steam, and all the men rushed down onto the beach with their pitchforks and their billhooks into the water, belabored the dragon, then out before the waves could claim them and before he raised his head. But the dragon never did raise his head. And in fact, if you go to Filey Brig, midway between Flamborough Head and Scarborough, you'll see that he's still there. What's left of him. And that is Billy Biter and the Parkin. There you are.